Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. On today's podcast, we're going to talk about, should you drop down to part-time work once you have a baby? What do you expect to do when you have a baby? Do you expect to work full-time, or are you going to drop down to part-time work? And why are you making this decision? Do you think it will free up your time and energy to be more connected to your child? And if you had a child and you went down to part-time work, what did it look like for you? What did it feel like? And how did it work? If you're a younger woman or a younger man and you're thinking about your future, how are you thinking about planning this out? What should you be strategizing? What does the research show? When you enter into parenthood, how should you be thinking about your career decisions? Usually at this point, I tell you about what I did in my life. But on this podcast, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to spoil the research for you. I made my decision very strategically because I knew what the research was showing in terms of what happened to mothers' careers after the transition into childbirth, after having their babies. And I made all of my decisions based on that research. I was strategic. I knew what it was going to look like. I knew what it was going to feel like, and I knew what the consequences were. And so I made an evidence-based decision. Now, you can make whatever decision in your own life. There's no right or wrong answer here, and worlds are complex and children have different needs, and what I did doesn't necessarily mean that will fit for you. And again, what the research shows doesn't necessarily mean you have to adapt your life in that way. But my goal always is for you to be armed with the most research and evidence that as you move through these decisions, and they're really important decisions, there's all these pivot points in women's lives where they make big, substantial, and important decisions that are going to set them on a different path, a different trajectory. And my goal always is, as you're thinking about those decisions, I want you to have as much evidence and research behind you. So you know, if I make this decision, here's where I might go. And if I make that decision, here's where I might go. I want you to be informed so you're making decisions with evidence. So on today's Misperceived, we're going to ask, is it a misperception that part-time work leaves parents less stressed? Is it an effective decision or a coping mechanism to help reduce the stress and the strain of parenting? Today, I'm going to talk to you about the research done by one of my absolute best friends in the entire world, Brendan Churchill, and his co-author, Lynn Craig, here at the University of Melbourne. They published this article in the Journal of Marriage and Family in 2019, and they were really interested in looking at what happened over time in Australia as parents transitioned in and out of part-time work. And what they did was they took this longitudinal data that they have here in Australia. It's called the HILDA, and it follows 4,000 mothers and 4,000 fathers across 15 years. All of these parents had a child under 17 in the home. And what they were interested in was what happens to parenting stress when mothers and fathers work part-time, or if they transition into part-time work, if they go from full-time to part-time, or from part-time to full-time, or they transition across work statuses. So one of the arguments is, you should transition or you should reduce your full-time work to part-time work, in part because that experience of being a parent is really stressful. And in theory, that would help reduce that stress, that you step back from your career a bit and then you step into part-time work to help balance everything out, to help reduce that stress and strain that comes with two demanding roles. I mean, I talked to you about this in another podcast, but you have this really demanding role of mother or of parent and this really demanding role of worker. And I've talked to women for decades, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many women have emailed me and said, I'm trying to do this all and it is so hard. I can't. It's unsustainable. It's exhausting. And many of them step back from their careers a little bit to help to balance it out. So does that work? Does that actually help reduce parenting stress? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how they measured that so you know the types of things that they're asking. And I want you to think about how would you agree with these statements. Now, this it's on a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so are you experiencing high levels of parenting stress? Do you agree with these statements or not? Are you ready? Here we go. Number 1, being a parent is harder than I thought. Absolutely right. Like I'm strong agree on that. Number 2, I often feel tired, worn out, or exhausted by meeting the needs of my children. I mean, that is a yes, like every day of my life, all day long. Number 3, I feel trapped by my responsibilities being a parent. That one I don't agree with. So I actually would go no on that. I don't feel trapped because I feel like I have a lot of options. But you may feel like it's very difficult to do the things you want to do, to step into different roles, in part because of the responsibilities as a parent. And this may be particularly true when you have little kids in the house. They need a lot of your time and energy and demands. Number 4, parenting is much more work than pleasure. No, I love parenting. I think it's so fun. It's fun to see your kids grow. It's a lot of pleasure. I love, love, love. And I love having the kids at my house. I love watching them goof around. So this one's a no for me too. Now, if I answered this, I would form 2 scales. I would be high on the first 2 and low on the bottom 2. So I actually would have some high parenting stress and then some low parenting stress or some parenting pleasure. But for you, you might see that actually you're high on all of them. And you might be high on all of them at different points in time when the demands at home intensify. Perhaps a parent is sick, or you're caring in other ways, or your work demands are intense. And so these things are measures, but they may not be perfect measures. So what they find is that, in general, people are higher on these values across them. And then they're trying to see, how does workforce transitions, how does that transition into part-time work impact that experience of parenting stress? Now, in theory, going from full-time to part-time or working part-time should be associated with less parenting stress, right? That's the goal. That's not quite what they find. Actually, that's not at all what they find. So what they find in this study is that when mothers are working part-time, when they're in that part-time role, they actually report more parenting stress than mothers who are working full-time. So actually, part-time work is associated with more parenting stress than full-time work. And if mothers transition out of full-time work and into part-time work, these mothers still report more parenting stress than their full-time equivalents. The parenting stress goes down a little bit, yes, but not enough to make it nothing. What's interesting is if mothers had a partner who is not in the labor market, then that's helpful. That helps them report less parenting stress. So if they work part-time, they report more. But if they have a partner who's at home, their parenting stress goes down. They do see that if a partner loses a job, they might see a spike in parenting stress. But over time, if you're a woman and you have a partner who is a stay-at-home parent, your parenting stress goes down. That person absorbs some of the work. And the result of that is your stress declines. What was interesting is that for fathers, their parenting stress wasn't tied at all to their employment. Fathers reported the same parenting stress if they were working part-time, if they were working full-time, if they were out of the labor market. It didn't matter how fathers worked. Their parenting stress wasn't tied to their employment. But for mothers, it was tied to that part-time work. And the fathers also, perhaps unsurprisingly, benefited too from having a partner who was not in employment. So if they had a stay-at-home mother or wife, their parenting stress went down. So both mothers and fathers reported less parenting stress if they had a partner who was not in the labor force or was staying at home. But for mothers, part-time work increased their parenting stress. And for fathers, it didn't matter if they were working at all. So what's going on here? Well, there's a couple things to note. We know that mothers are much more likely to exit employment to care for children. And we know in Australia in particular, it has some of the highest part-time work rates globally for mothers. So mothers in Australia are really likely to drop down to part-time work. And what we can see is that mothers are much more likely to exit the employment, but when mothers exit or they step out, it's fathers who benefit from that. Fathers report less parenting stress overall. And it really doesn't matter for fathers, but it does matter for mothers. So what's going on? Well, what I can tell you from our research and when we're doing interviews, we're hearing quite clearly that dads really enjoy the role of father. There's this difficulty in that transition into more time with them if they lose a job, but overall, they like being a dad. They like having more time with their kids. They like spending more time one-on-one. They like doing parenting differently. It's a really pleasurable experience. But for mothers, yes, there's pleasure in that experience, but there's a lot of stress. And what's interesting for mothers is that if they're dropping down to part-time work because they think that that's going to be the solution, that's going to be the silver bullet, it's actually not. It's showing that it's making their stress level higher. What's going on? Well, one thing that I can tell you is that they've just eroded the boundaries between work and family. They've just signaled at home, I'm taking on more of the home. And the problem is that part-time work is very rarely part-time. You may end up with part-time hours, but you very rarely end up with part-time work. And your employer is going to expect you to be there, to be on call, and to do a good job. And then guess what? Your family, now you've stepped into more of that role, they expect the same thing too. And now that you've transitioned your career and you've signaled you're the part-time worker and the full-time parent, you've taken on 1.5 roles, 100% at home, 0.5 at work. And there's research showing this, right? That part-time work is really, really hard to manage because people often don't cut the work in half. You often end up with expectations of more than your 20 hours. Something else that we hear is that often when mothers make these decisions after the transition into parenthood, like they're negotiating it, it's hard, there's little kids present, and they have a conversation with their spouse, right? That they're going to step back and step into more of the care and kind of downgrade their career for a little bit to re-elevate it later on. The problem is that those roles get set. That negotiation that happens right after the birth of the child can be difficult to undo later on, or it requires a conversation. It requires conflict. It requires a renegotiation of roles. It intensifies the stress on both partners later on. And this can be very, very difficult to come back in and renegotiate for heterosexual families. So, is it in fact a misperception that part-time work leaves parents less stressed? Well, yeah. Actually, there's evidence that stepping back into part-time work can actually increase the parenting stress, in part because now you're balancing multiple demands simultaneously. I want to be crystal clear on what I'm saying. I am not saying that those mothers working full-time are not stressed. It is difficult to balance both simultaneously regardless. But the problem is part-time work doesn't always have the work. In fact, what it can do is increase your work at home while still asking you to be attentive, engaged at work. And so this blurring of the boundaries between work and family can often be very stressful. So part-time work is not the silver bullet. And if you're stepping into these part-time roles, just be mindful, right? What's going to happen? Be mindful about what's expected for you with your kids, who's on call. Just tread carefully and make sure that you're crystal clear both with your partner, the other parent, and your employer about what you can and can't do. Because often women say yes, yes, yes to everything, don't want to let anybody down, want to be perfect in the role, or trying to do good work. But that's often at the expense of themselves. You should work however you want, exactly as you need, exactly at the moments that you need it. But as you transition between full and part-time work, just be aware. Part-time work sometimes can be still bigger than part-time. And often the family stuff comes to mothers, leading to more parental stress and strain. As per usual, I wish you great love, luck, light over the next week. Thank you so much for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, you just get to hang out with me. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.